One of the long-term consequences of maps that again we can overlook, but I think we should acknowledge more, is that maps created less than well within the last century, but potentially forgotten, are still having big impacts on the built environment or our perceptions of particular areas and things like that. And so the redlining example is a perfect case in point, where actually areas were effectively condemned as not being safe for investment, for homeowners loans, for all that kind of stuff, and so they weren't invested in. And so people thought, well, we'll just put a freeway down the middle of this one, or we won't plant the trees, or put in the public parks that we need, and all that kind of stuff. And so those are the built environment characteristics that are now impacting cities in a warming world, because of course we need, trees provide fantastic shade for people in heat waves. That the more concrete you have, the more reflective heat you have, the more heat that gets stored, all those kinds of problems. And so a map may be printed out in front of you, but really its power can often be seen by the decisions that are taken from it, and then the stuff that's been built as a result of that cartographic representation.
Yeah, and it's not just the impacts of heat. When I was working out in San Francisco, I spoke to a group called Shore Up Marin, and that's the county of Marin, just to the north of the city of San Francisco, and they are suffering these impacts in a similar way because of the way that redlining has taken place, the lack of investment, the lack of safeguarding in the built environment there, and so every time there is a king tide, that shoreline gets flooded. And the priority that the local authorities had was to build a freeway through that area, rather invest in a freeway, so people could get to and from the city of San Francisco a lot easier through the north, through Marin, rather than investing in safeguarding those communities. So that is a story I heard from the local activists just a few years ago, and it's an issue, of course, it's getting worse because of rising sea levels and climate change.
I mean, I think one note of optimism is that we now have more data available to us that is more accessible to more people, and the tools available to create your own maps and your counter maps. Indeed. And things like that. And I think using those to leverage or to go against prevailing power is actually quite a positive thing. And the nice thing actually about some of these data sets, of course, is that what they tell us is unequivocal in many respects. And so one of the examples we have in the book is related to the Flint water crisis, and how the city of Flint in Michigan changed its water supply to save money. It then was a different chemical composition in the water, so the lead leached out into the water and poisoned the population effectively. And some modelers at the University of Michigan actually came up with a way of pinpointing quite effectively the houses that were most likely to have lead pipes feeding them. And the city undertook quite an effective campaign of replacing those lead pipes based on that model. But the problem was some parts of the city, the more affluent ones, the ones with the newer buildings, less likely to have lead pipes, felt that they deserved their pipes checking and digging up as well. And so the political pressures meant the city abandoned the model for a time. Its success rate hugely dropped. It cost a fortune in wasted effort. And in the end, they reverted back to that original data set. And I think that some of the power in the data, is that it can call out some of these poor political decisions ultimately, and that's it's incumbent on all of us to use data in an effective way to kind of hold people to account that might otherwise prefer those data sets not be out in the public domain or something.
And I think that Flint, Michigan example is actually a good, shall we call it, upgrade from the one that gets classically used in schools to show how these things can be very powerful. Of course, is Jon Snow's cholera map. Of course, how simple, how just putting data points on a map and think, I think this problem is due to this pump in this street in London, and then to look at that and think, okay, this one in Flint, Michigan, you've got all these other kind of aspects and issues and nuances
actually
around it.
the thing about snow is that is it's a bit, there's a bit of mythology around that map. So he actually had his theory. He knew that cholera was a waterborne disease, and he did a huge amount of data collection, contact tracing, a phrase that we hear a lot now. He established how someone in Hampstead may have died from cholera, because actually it turns out this lady was living in Soho. She so liked the water that she actually got people to bring her the water every day from the pump in Soho. And that ultimately is what killed her and made her niece ill, and snow connected those dots. And so the map was actually a further kind of elaboration or illustration that said, unequivocally, we've got more people dying around this pump. And it's a further example. But at the time it was not until after he died that people acknowledged he was right. And even up until the 1910s and 1920s, there were some parts of Europe that did not endorse the kind of waterborne view of cholera, because it held water companies to account and it cost money to upgrade the water supplies. And so again, there's some really interesting examples where cities kind of held out against the view because they knew that it would cost them too much money to upgrade their water.
And how interesting that one of the issues that's being talked about today, of course, is the release of sewage, by water companies into our rivers and oceans, and how there's a lot of citizen pressure going push back on that, especially on social media, utilising these maps and showing how all of a sudden we're now having these red flags come up to say, well, this was a beach or an area or a river or something, or a water outlet that was safe to bathe in. It actually was designated as you could bathe in it, and now because of this data that is available.
And that's another great example of like the map. I think the map has driven what I think broke that story and made it kind of a national scandal was the map that showed. I'm not sure who created it, but I definitely saw a lot of a map that was not a particularly elaborate one, but it just showed where the sewage discharges were and how many had happened at any given moment. And again, it kind of shocked people into thinking, it visualized for them a national problem that needed national action.
Right, exactly.
And so that, again, is a really nice example of the power of maps, to make a difference, I think.
So let's stick with pollution then, because one of the maps in your book is called Inexhaustive Detail, which deals with air pollution. And this is shocking. Well, we know that this has been in the news quite a fair bit as well. And, the shocking statistic that you mentioned in your book, which is 8.9 million people in 2015 were killed by air pollution, and 790,000 in Europe alone in that year. That's just a staggering number. And when I look at this through a geographical eye, I remember teaching when we talk about economic development and stuff like that. I used to have fun with the children about the Europe's hot banana, because of the shape of the way that the Industrial Revolution kind of went from southern England and then kind of spread its way through. And of course, the term hot to make it was an economic core. There was a lot of activity going from there. And when I looked at this map of showing where the poor air quality was, it does quite fit that kind of hot banana shape. And of course, and then there's the redistribution according to the weather conditions and everything like that. So that was really, really, really interesting. And then of course you've got these plumes of air pollution emanating from areas of the Middle East, from the oil-rich nations as well. So I really want to kind of think to yourself about why you thought this was this is almost more of a classic kind of style map compared to the other things that you include in the book. It really is here is the pollution that has taken place, the concentrations of this pollution of nitrogen dioxide concentrations, and here's where it is mapped over this time. So why did you decide to include this one, which is probably more closer to the classic kind of things we might show in a geography classroom?
It's good. It's a good question. I think for me, It's one of the best examples of how data collection has changed in a relatively short period of time. So if you imagine, the way that we might have collected pollution data, say, I don't know, a decade or certainly 2 decades ago, is through things like weather balloons, putting up, or, you can do street level pollution measurements and things like that. And in those cases, it was always specific locations, right? So you would have to collect some kind of specific readings around, and then you might have to use a computer model or something else like that to try and guess what the pollution levels are like between the known locations. And there'll be some parts of the world that you just don't measure. You just got no idea. Whereas thanks to this satellite, which is called Sentinel-5, it's part of the European Space Agency's Copernicus program. This thing goes overhead pretty much every day for every part of the planet, and it can get some sense of what nitrogen dioxide levels are, the ozone levels, and various other carbon monoxide, various other measurements. And it can do it for a whole area, assuming there's not too much cloud and all that kind of stuff. And it creates this kind of impartial, in the sense that it's got, the sensor is just telling us what's there, but quite powerful image of where the worst pollution is at any given moment, and how that pollution changes over time, and where it's emanating from, and so on. So yeah, pick out the oil-rich nations, parts that Lebanon's pretty one of the worst, because it's still its power stations are incredibly unclean, and then we have this, kind of, as you say, arc of pollution that's coming from like the Rhine Valley and the Channel, and shipping in the Channel, and flights and so on, sitting over, the British Isles during hot weather. But it also outs some other, big polluters, like the cruise ship industry around Marseille. Marseille comes up with a big orange flash on it, and it often is, and that's because, cruise ships are some of the worst polluting things on the planet, and you can see the impact it's having just in that particular area. So having, this image change over time, people can look it up and see different versions of the maps and make decisions about, what needs to be done to reduce the pollution. I think was just a nice example, as you say. It's a traditional looking map, but actually it's created from very high tech data.
And this reminds me actually of a project that I was made aware of when I worked with scientists in Boulder, Colorado. So we worked for NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and they were working on a project called the Carbon Tracker. And what the Carbon Tracker was doing was very, very similar to this, is that because it's just, as you said, impartial data, it was purely and simple setting up a sensor network based on all these kind of things, weather balloons, aircraft sampling techniques, air core systems, which is a really unique way of taking effectively the same thing as an ice core, but for air, through the way a weather balloon descends, satellite imagery, in order to track really, really accurately sources of pollution and sources of carbon dioxide in particular. And this is a way that they just generate, and of course, because they're a state-sponsored entity, they're the US government body, just a simple way of saying, this is where it's coming from. Now, you policymakers, what are you going to do about it? And that kind of gives me the kind of sense about how powerful these simple kind of tracking things, all these multiple technologies come into play with this. And as you said, a way of positive use of mapping, and how to try and readdress the balance of power.
Yeah, because you can hold, you can hold governments to account, and you can actually say, whatever. France can say to Germany, well, look, we can see there's all this pollution your industry's creating, it's blowing over to us, you're going to do something about it, and things like that. I think, hopefully will provide just more intelligence to kind of how we deal with some of these challenges around pollution and global climate change and so on.
And there is precedence because, going back into, before we had things like Sentinel-5, of course, we had the problems that of the United Kingdom's Industrial Revolution was causing to the Scandinavian nations with acid rain. And when I was learning geography at GCSE back in the 90s, that was one of the main environmental issues that we were talking about was acid rain and sulfur dioxide causing sulfur and destroying these forests over in Scandinavia because, of course, the prevailing wind coming from the southwest, and that was an issue that was sorted, because they had the data a little bit, not as technologically advanced as it is today, but it just goes to show how powerful it is.